And that moment of realization that there were drugs that could alter your perception of reality was the first time that I understood that my perception of reality wasn't reality.
Welcome to Psychedelic Source, where wisdom meets practice in the evolving landscape of psychedelic medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Sandra Dreisbach, and I'm here to help you navigate the complex intersection of ethics, business, and personal growth in a psychedelic space. Whether you're a practitioner, therapist, entrepreneur, or simply curious about this transformative field, you've found your source for authentic dialogue, practical resources, and community connection. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the stories, strategies, and ethical considerations that matter most to our growing ecosystem. Let's tap in to our inner source of wisdom and explore what it means to build a sustainable and ethical psychedelic future together.
The information shared on this podcast, our website, and other platforms may be triggering for some viewers and readers and is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. While we explore topics related to altered states of consciousness, we do not endorse or encourage illegal activities or substance use. Always research your local laws and consult qualified professionals for guidance. The content provided is, as is, and we are not liable for any actions taken based on the information shared. Stay supported and informed, act responsibly, and enjoy the podcast.
In this episode of Psychedelic Source, we meet with Mitchell Gomez, who is currently Executive Director of DanceSafe. He is a graduate of New College of Florida, has his master's from CU Denver. Mitchell joined DanceSafe as the National Outreach Director in 2014, and he was promoted to Executive Director in March of 2017. He has served on the advisory council of both PsychSems and Symposia, and is a harm reduction consultant for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And Mitchell has also volunteered with the Burning Man organization, SSDP, which is Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and other small harm reduction projects for many years, and is a passionate advocate for reality-based drug policy and harm reduction. And I'm really excited that we get to have the opportunity to look at what does it mean to do psychedelic use from a Western, global North sense, responsibly in these recreational settings. We have a lot of association in our Western lens with psychedelics as being recreational from the 60s onward. And you'll hear us talk a little bit about that. But the fact is that therapeutic use can be in many contexts and settings, and also has a deep history in traditional settings outside of recreation, but also within recreational settings. And I hope that we get to see ways that you can source responsibly, removing harm, reducing risk, and hear a little bit of Mitchell's journey in how and why he's so passionate about this work. I'm so grateful to have Mitchell here with us from DanceSafe. And as someone who deeply cares about ethics and safety, to have DanceSafe represented and to have you in particular as the founder and still very much in
current
charge.
executive director, not founder.
Oh, current executive director. My apologies. Current executive director, which I also appreciate too, because I think that's part of the story sometimes people miss is how things get started. But before we go too far, do you want to give like a brief description of like you and what you're doing now?
Yeah, like my how I ended up here is the question.
Yeah. How did you start? Like, people kind of get the idea of what it means to dance safe, but they don't necessarily, it might not necessarily understand like what brought you to try and create this more safe environment for people in psychedelic recreational spaces primarily, but all spaces.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that answer. One is, how DanceSafe got there, and then one is how I ended up here as
Well, let's start with you. Because I always like to start with the personal.
Yeah. So when I was growing up, my parents had this really permissive attitude towards reading. Like anything that I was like capable of reading, they would like let me read. And that resulted in a few things that like there were definitely books I read that I feel like in retrospect maybe were not appropriate. But on the upside of that, when I was I want to say like 11 or 12, I came across a copy of Leary and Metzner's psychedelic book that was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the psychedelic manual.
Ah.
Uh, and yeah, I was 11 or 12. I was capable of reading it. I read it. My parents never said anything about it being on my shelf. And I was immediately fascinated by the idea of psychedelics. At that age, my understanding of drugs was that there were drugs that made you go faster and drugs that made you go slower, is sort of how I thought of drugs, right? I was a kid. I grew up in rural Weld County in Colorado. There was not a lot of exposure. And so that's what I thought of as drugs. And I remember reading one section of that book where I believe it's Leary talking about, watching this plant in his office melt. And I remember reading this paragraph over and over and over again because I just like couldn't understand like what he was saying. I was having a really hard time understanding like what he was saying. And that moment of realization that there were drugs that could alter your perception of reality was the first time that I understood that my perception of reality wasn't reality, right? That those were separate things. I never had that realization. And I think that people never have that realization. So having it at that
Well,
young,
as a card-carrying philosopher,
yeah, yeah, that moment of realization. But I was really under the impression that LSD was a thing that had existed in the 1960s, 1970s. But it had been like effectively wiped out by the government, right? Like the book ends with like the story of criminalization and like, them getting kicked out of Harvard. There was an afterword. It wasn't a, first edition, obviously. And so, yeah, that was my understanding. And then I ended up in a DARE class. And
really? Oh my
this
goodness.
DARE officer was
good
talking about,
times.
he was talking about these, dangerous pieces of paper that can have, this drug LSD that can make you crazy and all this stuff that I already knew was nonsense. And the phrasing I love for this is that I had some follow-up questions about the sort of people to avoid if I did not want to be exposed to this dangerous substance, right? And he mentioned raves. And it took me like 3 or 4 weekends. It was the weekend after my 14th birthday, that I ended up at my first rave, with a group of older kids from my high school. And this was not like a club or a party that was being called a rave. This was a rave. This was mid-90s, Tampa. There was this really, really robust underground break scene. You had to go to a gas station and the guy decided if you were cool enough to get the next waypoint. I mean, it was a rave.
Wow.
Shockingly, nobody would sell 14-year-old Mitchell any acid. But I did find some MDMA on the ground. I found some press pills
Oh my goodness.
on
Some
the
pressies.
ground. And so, yeah, it was the weekend after my 14th birthday that I first tried MDMA.
Wow.
Which I really, really loved. I mean, I immediately really resonated with that substance, and it's still one that is really like meaningful to me, although I'm quite careful about my use, in my 40s in
Absolutely.
a way that I wasn't at 14. But yeah, it took a couple years for me to get real LSD. Psilocybin was in Florida was quite easy in those ages. I was 15 the first time I tried mushrooms, older when I first tried LSD, but all of them have never really lost their fascination for me because I do think the big question is how our brains are able to generate a reasonable approximation of reality that seems to work well enough, right? How a few pounds of gelatin becomes aware that it's a few pounds of gelatin, I think is the big question. And I do still think that psychedelics are the main tool that we will have to answer that question from the inside, right? There's other tools that we're developing to answer it from the outside. But meeting in the middle of those two sort of methodologies for understanding how consciousness arises is the thing that I think about more often than anything else. Like, how does my brain know it's my brain? And so, yeah, they've really never lost their fascination for me. And I really wanted to go into psychedelic research academically.
So before you go on more about the psychedelic research piece, like I'm kind of curious, like going back to those origins, like first being introduced via a book, right? Right? Being curious, being young and curious, and already having certain myths kind of revealed, and then having the sort of like just say no to drugs sort of campaign, dare campaign. And you could even argue maybe even despite that.
Yeah, because of it. I mean, this is,
Yeah. Yeah. Then pursuing it actively because the curiosity continued. But how did you feel like in terms of like those first initial experiences? What would you describe your relationship? Is more of it was it really just the fascination of how it could change your perception? Or was it more about like that sort of continuing curiosity? Or
yeah, I think it's some of that. I think some of it is that I just like having a big question without an answer is a thing that like my ADHD brain doesn't deal well with. And so when I don't understand something, I'm often really driven to understand it. So some of it was that, just the curiosity. Some of it was the sort of experiential things around the ability for them to just do really interesting things. Uh, and some of it was just that I found them to be really enjoyable. Like, I do think that particularly on the sort of like, more spiritual side of the psychedelic movement, there's this tendency to dismiss the idea of like fun as an intention. It was like, no, like that was my intention, was to like have a really good time at this rave, right? And I think that's a perfectly valid intentional use for psychedelics, is to have an enjoyable experience.
yeah, and I love that you bring that up because there's I mean, as much as I appreciate the therapeutic aspect, having been sort of raised myself in the Silicon Valley, where the recreational was more foregrounded than any sort of therapeutic for a long time. The fact that there's even a sense of even loss of that recreational aspect because that's seen as more bad than therapeutic use. Like therapy, okay, a recreational bad, but I'm
Certainly
not
microdosing to maximize capitalist output, totally fine,
or
right?
yeah, or microdosing, right? Because that's an exceptional, like you don't affect your ability to produce, right? So I appreciate you bringing that up too. But how did that end up translating into to dance safe?
Yeah. So I really was quite interested in doing psychedelic research. The only school I applied to for my undergrad was New College of Florida. That's where Rick Doblin started MAPS. It's where Earth and Fire were students as well. Pre-Irwid. Lene from Zendo as well, though she was actually in my year. Like she was Lene and I were students at the same time. Um, and yeah, doing a year of organic chemistry with Paul Scudder is what convinced me I was not going to be doing original PhD work in this field. Uh, I passed, I got through, but doing OChem with the guy who wrote Electron Flow and Organic Chemistry, it was a great experience and also absolutely the hardest year of my life. I mean, nothing I've done since then is compared to the amount of like time that I put into OChem. Uh, but no, at the same time, DanceSafe was a thing, right? I mean, this is, when I first started Winter Raves, DanceSafe didn't exist. But by the time I left high school, DanceSafe and other small harm reduction projects were coming up. There was one in Florida that I actually did a few events with that had what I thought was a very clever name, but did not lend itself to people coming to the booth, which was a Drug Educated America. So DEA, it's like, I get it, you're being funny, but like, not
Yeah,
a thing.
you're triggering people a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, my motivation around harm reduction, around being involved in harm reduction, is just the tremendous number of friends that I lost over the years.
Yeah,
It's like substantially more than half of my high school rave crew is not alive anymore.
yeah.
And it was a big crew. I mean, we're not talking about one or two deaths. I had a moment where I was like in my mid 20s, maybe 25, 26. And I was at a wedding, and I had this realization that I'd been to twice as many funerals as weddings.
Oh my goodness.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, and so, yeah, it's a real thing. I mean, the reason I'm alive is that the drug markets weren't as screwed up when I was like finding pills on the ground, right? And so this is like a constant source of motivation for me, is that I wasn't making like rational risk analyses. I was a 15-year-old who wanted ecstasy and nobody wanted to sell it to me. So if I found some at a rave, I was very likely going to take it. And at that age, there weren't even test kits, 96, 97, 98,
No,
my
there
first 3
weren't.
years going to raves. There
Yeah.
was no way to test your substances. It was literally just put it in your mouth and hope. And so, yeah, that's my personal motivation. But there was a job opening for DanceSafe 11 years ago as outreach director. I'd been volunteering with MAPS for a while. I've known, Rick since college, easily one of the, 3 or 4 biggest influences in my life. And I was actually hesitant to apply. I had some not great experiences with DanceSafe volunteers, like in the late, early 2000s, late 90s, maybe. I think early 2000s, sort of trying to piece together fuzzy memories from several decades ago that were fuzzy when I made them. But early 2000s, some volunteers who'd said some things that I knew weren't true. Some behavior that I was a little hesitant to be involved with an organization that I had seen from some of these folks. It was the norm within harm reduction. It was the norm within rave spaces, but just personal hesitations. And so I did what I always do when I don't know what to do, which is I called Rick.
Is that what you do? Is that how you make decisions? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, often I call someone I whose opinion I respect. I try
at
to
the
bounce
time it
ideas
was
off.
because you trusted him, and that was
Yeah, and I
why.
trusted
Yeah.
him, and still very much do. But I have a much bigger group of humans I can call now. That's great. I don't have to always bother Rick. He's got a lot going on. And he asked me 2 questions. The first was if I thought that the mission was important, which obviously I do, right? I mean, I've lost so many friends. And even before I was involved with DanceSafe, I was already publicly speaking out around the idea of harm reduction, not just as the things we do to make drug use safer, but as the alternative model to prohibition for how society can integrate and deal with drug use. Right? It's not just a thing we do under prohibition, although there's plenty of things that are just created by prohibition that are dealt with by harm reduction. But harm reduction is the alternative philosophy for drug use. And so I think it's really important to build it
Well,
out.
and let's take a pause and talk about that. So what is harm reduction for you? Like, how do you define it personally? It doesn't have to be what DanceSafe identifies. Like, well, how do you
Yeah.
define it?
Yeah. I mean, I think that really does sum it up, is that harm reduction is a way of thinking about drug use that accepts that drug use is going to happen. It accepts that use is going to happen in ways that I personally would not use or personally don't necessarily agree with, even if but that we as a society can then choose how to deal with that use and how to deal with that use that we don't necessarily would personally engage with. And harm reduction is just accepting that people are going to make those choices and providing them the tools and knowledge they need to be as safe as they would like to be while making those decisions. And that's all it really takes. Like, most users of most drugs don't develop any of the things that historically would be called addiction. Um,
Right.
Most people who do develop unhealthy behavior patterns, if you can keep them safe, they will often choose to change those patterns. And so just treating drug use as a public health issue that you address from a harm reduction standpoint is really all we have to do around drugs. Like, that's it. Like, there's no need to put anyone in cages. There's no need to spend these billions of dollars, trying to stop drugs from entering the country. Like, none of it is necessary. Yeah, so that was the first question. And then the second question was, do you think you have a better chance of getting the organization where you think it should be as an employee of the organization or bitching from the outside? And so I hung up the phone and I applied to be outreach director. And so, yeah, that was 11 years ago. So, and then a few years later, the executive director at the time was no longer involved in the organization. There was this really exhaustive job hunt. It was not like, she stepped down and suddenly I was ED. In fact, one of the board members phrased it to me as, "Mitchell, this isn't fucking Game of Thrones." Right? So there's this.
Now, why do they say that? Now, why do
Oh,
they say
it was
that?
mostly a joke, but he was basically saying, like, just because you're the next in line, that's not how this works. You don't get to step into the role just because you're the next employee.
It's not automatic.
It's not automatic.
It's not automatic.
And ultimately, they actually found 2 people they really liked. It was me and another person, and said, "We would like you to be co-executive directors." I thought that was a terrible idea at the time. I was like, what ship doesn't have 2 captains? I think was the phrase that I used. But they brought her on as a deputy director and promoted me to executive director. That was 8 years ago. She is no longer involved in the organization. She now does a Psychedelic Bar Association and a bunch of other really awesome stuff. But interestingly, we have actually landed with a 3-member executive staff. So there's 3 people whose authority is equal, our pay is linked within our spheres of responsibility. We're a ship with 3 captains, and we actually make it work really, really well. This distributed power system.
Yeah,
I do still
I
think it was the
love
right
that.
call not to agree to do that with a person I had never met. I do still think that was the absolute right call.
As someone who really cares about collaborative models myself, like I think it's really cool to hear about ones that are successful, then whether you're trying to share, leadership roles in different
Yeah,
aspects of the
it's
organization.
tealish, it's not
Yeah,
a teal organization, but tealish.
teal-ish, yeah, yeah. And I think we're gonna have different. I mean, I think there's also depending upon the org what fits for what they do, right?
Sure, and there's definitely challenges. I mean, there are things that are made much harder by the fact that I can't just say like, "Hey, I'm executive director, this is how we're doing it," right? Like, uh, but I think that it definitely cuts into that sort of problem inherent with power, right?
Yeah.
Where you begin to believe that your decisions are always correct, even if you know that that's what power does. You tend to get a little loosey-goosey on ethics, even if you know you shouldn't. Like, this is just how power operates. And so by distributing the power, particularly, as a straight cis man, having 2 women be the other members of the executive staff, uh, those problems seem to be mitigated to a pretty large degree. I can't just make a decision and run with it, right? Like, that's not how the organization operates. And that can be a weakness, but boy, it is also really a strength. The fact that I'm forced to think about impacts on the larger system. I'm, required to get buy-in from other people within the system, is a really, really powerful. I don't want to say like stopgap, but it works as an opposing force to
Well,
that.
no, it creates a built-in sort of accountability
Yeah.
too. Um, but I wanna shift a little bit, back to, like, where harm reduction and I actually also usually like to say risk reduction, but, we don't have to talk about that that whole issue, right? But a lot of that has to do with, like, trying to shift our mindset around harm and
I mean,
risk,
we've
right?
even been starting to use benefit maximization.
Right, no, I've heard that too, right? Like, because a lot of times people throw around the word like harm reduction, not in your case, but I've noticed like that, like it's automatically going to be a harm, right? That there isn't necessarily going to be a harm, but you need to be aware of the harms and reducing risks. But I also like benefit maximization as another way of thinking it, but not to the point of where we feel like we're bypassing the harms. But I would be curious to hear what do you feel are the challenges now versus like let's say in the early 90s because that's like I was part of the rave culture too and I would agree with you like there weren't testing like there wasn't and I've lost people as well and that definitely motivates a lot of my work but how would you say the landscape has changed like because there are harm reduction tools there is information out there people can google stuff they got the social media things what would you say are the biggest things people should be aware of
Yeah.
now compared to then.
Yeah. I mean, uh, I think maybe the biggest one, is just the speed at which new substances can enter markets. Right? It used to be that if you wanted to develop and test a brand new drug, you had to be a Sasha Shulgin, right? Like you had to have the knowledge, the lab, the care to develop a substance that the safety profile made sense and it was, an enjoyable experience. It was I mean, realistically, if Sasha had been working in any other field of chemistry other than psychedelic drugs, he would have a Nobel Prize, right? Like it took that level of intellect to be the type of person who could develop and bring a new drug to market, whatever that term means. Um, Now there are labs in Asia where you can just send them a drawing of a theoretically psychoactive substance, right? You just draw out mescaline, erase a line over here and add an oxygen and put something over here with a hydrogen. You've made a brand new drug. It's not illegal because the nature of a free society is that anything that's not banned is legal, right? This thing doesn't exist anywhere except on that piece of paper where you just drew it. You send a picture to the lab, and I've never tried this, but there are labs that say that they can deliver a gram in 30 days.
Wow. Wow. And even more so, like, especially, I wanna use, like, maybe a case example, like, I know, like, for example, the Diamond Shrooms product, and I'm not trying to say anything and against the brand per se, but, like, it's one of those cases where you can see that there were negative results, and part of it where a lot of these products weren't b like, even the combination of products weren't being tested, let alone whether or not it was some sort of, some of the parts were synthetic pieces
Yeah, I
that
mean,
were brought in.
you see products in head shops that just say like proprietary blend of tryptamines, right?
Right.
Okay, cool. Like, what does that mean, right? And so yeah, it's we're really seeing a really rapid escalation of new drugs entering market. Uh, obviously exemplified, I think, best by the increase in synthetic opioids as border enforcement steps up, right? Every time you make it harder to smuggle substances from point A to point B, the natural reaction from those markets is to switch to more potent synthetic analogs. This is a dynamic that was written about as early as the 1940s after alcohol prohibition, right? The primary alcohols in the United States that were consumed before prohibition were beer and wine. The switch to hard liquor happened in response to prohibition. It didn't make sense to smuggle wine, right? This is why cocktails exist as a social phenomenon, is that the drug sellers, the illegal drug sellers at speakeasies, had to create a way to cut the drugs that had become too strong because of prohibition to make them palatable to an end user like drug purchaser.
Yeah, and I think that's a fascinating case to, like, look at. Now, for those who don't understand what a synthetic alkaloid is.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So I'm talking about things like fentanyl replacing heroin, right? So now we have a situation where they made it so difficult to smuggle heroin that most of the no, not most, but a large number of people who are smuggling these substances have switched to fentanyl, carfentanil. There's a whole galaxy of these opioids that, were often developed for medical use. But the synthesis on them is very, very easy, comparatively.
And cheap.
Yep. And yeah, I mean, a person who's making like a fake hydrocodone pill using fentanyl, there's a real possibility that like they spent more money on the binding agents and like the pill press dyes than they did on the fentanyl that's being bound, like than they did on the active drug. Like they actually spent more to manufacture this thing on the other parts of the component than they did on the active component. It's that cheap to manufacture, right? We're talking about fractions of a penny per dose. But it's really the smuggling advantage, and yeah, the iron law of prohibition is the term that was coined after alcohol prohibition, which can broadly be summarized as the harder the drug laws, the harder the drugs.
I think that's a moment to just even reflect on that. The harder the drug laws, the harder the drugs. So, like, so it makes me want to ask, like, I mean, there's multiple solutions and ways of approaching it, but just that alone, like, so what would be, and there's a lot of press about the fentanyl and opioid crisis. I obviously personally deeply care about, fentanyl contamination and people having naloxone and kits and things like that. What's your sort of personal, if you were to magically have a wand to fix the opioid and fentanyl crisis right now, what would be the three things you would do?
Yeah, so this is a Mitchell answer, not a DanceSafe answer.
That's
But yeah,
fine.
I'll give you my Mitchell answer. I want to be clear that when I talk about drug legalization, that there's a literal Bible of like regulatory models for drugs, right? I'm not necessarily saying sell all drugs at 7-Eleven to anyone of any age.
Right.
But I do think that creating appropriate regulatory models so that every person can access the drugs that they desire to consume in some sort of regulated legal way is the way out of this. And I'm not talking about decriminalization. Decriminalization often makes things worse because it does leave control of access in the hands of people who, by definition of the system, are criminals, right? If you don't legalize sales, and I'm not making a value judgment on people who sell these substances. I'm just saying that like that is the definitional term. When it's not legal and those are the only people who can sell it, you have left it in the control of criminal enterprise. And so I'm talking about legalization. And there's a group in the UK, I believe it's called Transform Drug Policy, that has written an actual book. I mean, it is a thick book on different regulatory models that may be appropriate for different drugs, right? And we're all familiar with these within the US because we have different regulatory models for different drugs, right? So the regulatory model for tobacco is different than the regulatory model for alcohol. The regulatory model for alcohol is different state by state. There's some states that control the hours it can be sold. I think most states
Or
do.
dry counties. There's
Dry
counties in
county.
Texas that was the case, right?
Right. So
And then needing a card, right, and things
right.
like that.
And I think we're all immediately aware that legalization of drugs does not legalize all behavior while you're on drugs, right? So the fact
Right.
that alcohol is legally available in certain contexts to certain people of a certain age doesn't mean that just because you can legally consume alcohol, that you can consume as much as you want and then drive a vehicle or go to work or fly an airplane, right? And so when I say legalization, I think a lot of people hear me saying like, oh, we should sell heroin at 7-Eleven. Right? Like if you're a 10-year-old, you could walk into 7-Eleven, you could buy heroin. That's what, when people say like, what do you mean that all drugs should be legal? And what I mean is that we need to figure out ways that people can get the drugs they want without having to rely on criminal enterprise for
Yeah, but wouldn't you
access.
think like decrim would still be part of that model towards legalization? Like, but in part and
It can
parcel. I
be,
mean,
but
you can look at what happened in Oregon, for example, where there was both decriminalization and legalization that was happening at the same time. And then people,
the
had a
problem is there tends to be
reaction
pushback.
and then they recriminalized,
Right.
right? And while having legal access only to certain people with a high price tag,
Yeah.
right? So like, um and only for one substance, for what it's worth, because that's you're saying beyond one
Oh,
substance.
yeah. No, I'm saying that all people who want all substances. And part of the reason I'm so skeptical of the like molecule by molecule model for decrim or legal access is twofold. One is that actually threefold. One is that it often tends to just be an expression of privilege, right? These decrim nature campaigns have had some tremendous successes. But every time a decrim nature campaign has reached out being like, hey, would you like to write something about it? We're trying to legalize plant medicines in my city. I always offer to do it if I can write it on cocaine, right? Cocaine is a naturally occurring alkaloid within the coca plant. It is not synthetic. It is not semi-synthetic. There is cocaine in the coca plant. You can chew the leaves. That is oral administration of cocaine, full stop. Not one of them has let me do that, right? Not one of them has taken me up on this offer. And so what does decrim nature mean when you're leaving out arguably the most commonly used plant medicine in the United States? There
Yeah,
are
other than
certainly
like maybe tobacco or something like.
right, other than like maybe tobacco, maybe marijuana, but like in terms of like ones that are currently still heavily stigmatized, heavily criminalized, cocaine is a plant medicine any way you slice it, right? That is just a factually true statement. And so it leaves out, it's an expression of privilege where it's just like often relatively resourced white folks just legalizing the psychedelics that they like. So that's a criticism that I think is really valid. But another one is that we're never going to build a national coalition to decriminalize or legalize some of these really heavily stigmatized drugs, right? Like the idea that we're going to do it around heroin, the idea that we're going to do it around cocaine, the idea that we're going to do it around fentanyl, because there are people who prefer fentanyl to heroin, and those people also have the right to take whatever substance they want under whatever regulatory model makes sense for those substances. And the idea that you would build a national campaign to legalize fentanyl when we've had this like billions of dollars in government spending propagandizing the public against these substances seems really, really unlikely.
Well, what's your position on sacred use? So, like cocoa plant that you mentioned, right, has a long, long history of sacred plant medicine use, and including even oracular readings, getting a cocoa leaf reading, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
right? One reading that I received, like the person was trained for over 30 years before they were allowed to do a reading with it,
Yeah.
right? What's your general position in terms of legalization and sacred use?
Yeah. I mean, I think that when, sacred and spiritual use is sincere, and I often think that it is, not universally, we've definitely seen examples of people using that, right, as
Oh,
a way
yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
No.
yeah. I think that in addition to all of the human rights violations that are intrinsic to the drug war, then we're certainly running into the fact that the government is regulating which religions can or can't be practiced within the United States. But I think that ultimately, from a legalization standpoint, uh, the core issue is either we own our minds and bodies or the government owns our minds and bodies. And I don't see any fundamental, I don't want to say difference, but a person who's using a highly stigmatized drug for fun and a person who is using a less stigmatized drug for a spiritual reason, both of those being illegal are both a violation of those individuals' human rights. And so I don't think it's necessary when we're talking about these movements to necessarily use that to move the conversation. I do think that from a tactical, immediate access standpoint, right, these psilocybin churches are great. When they're sincere, when they're done ethically, I think they're great. They destigmatize use in general, they increase access. I do believe that more people using psychedelics is a generally good thing for society, particularly when it's used in a structured context of
Right.
this like spiritual use.
But we certainly have seen insincere, I mean, in the sense of, like, people using it in at least in theory to protect in theory to protect themselves legally, from for use, right? That
Yeah.
that and
Although in theory,
and I'm
green
not
card
a lawyer, I
protect you
can't
from
say that they're
immediate
gonna be legally
deportation. So
safe.
like,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I do think that it's theory, not practice, and I think we might see that tested pretty heavily. But maybe not. I mean, maybe this is just not a thing that anyone cares about. And that would be great. And no, look, I think that I certainly know people personally who have been accused of doing that, right? Of like, oh, this is performative. This is, and it's like, no, like there's some of these people who've been accused of that who I know for damn sure are serious, are sincere, right? And so it's easy sometimes to misread the situation from the outside as well. And I
sure.
don't know of any way of judging a person's religious beliefs on sincerity. Like, forget psychedelics.
No, believe me, yeah,
Right. Bro, look, there's plenty of people who claim to follow a guy who spoke repeatedly against wealth and yet have private jets that belong to their churches,
Well,
right? So, like,
and
I don't
and
know how to judge
And
sincerity.
in real defense here, like, it's not an uncommon psychedelic experience to be able to say, like, "I saw that I was God,"
True.
right? And then have I don't mean to say, like, everyone has a delusion of grandeur experience just because they've had that, insight in
Yeah,
that
one of my favorite
moment.
lines from Tea Fairy is anyone who thinks that psychedelic kills egos never spent time with a former acid cook. And like, boy, that lands. Like, yeah, it's psychedelics do a lot of interesting things. General reduction in ego does not, in fact, seem to be one of them. And also this idea that it universally makes you more connected to like all people also seems to be pretty patently false.
Well, just to give it a little bit of argument, right? Wouldn't you say that, like, it's substance dependent perhaps, like, or relationship dependent or set and setting, like, there's a lot of other factors that can
I
be
think it's
part
more set and setting than anything.
Mm.
I think that there's a really amazing academic article that I can't remember the title of, but it was written up as a popular article called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis. This is
Oh,
by
wow.
Brian Pace from Symposia.
Oh, yes, yes, I
Yeah,
know this.
that is a article about a group of self-described neo-Nazi asset heads. Right? These are people who successfully integrated a psychedelic into their culture as self-described neo-Nazis, right? The in-group bonding, the us versus them, the thing that psychedelics seem to do pretty universally is increase creativity. That does seem to happen pretty universally. It makes you a more creative thinker. I think because it destabilizes your like connections and then they're trying to reconnect and they connect in new ways. Other than that, it seems to mostly be set and setting, right? I think
Well
that's
well
where the bulk of the experience really happens.
well, speaking of set and setting, I can't help but mention the setting that you find yourself in this conversation. Could you talk a little bit about, the lovely sculptures and artifacts that you have behind you? And
Yeah, so I was raised pretty disconnected from my father's ethnic background. My father's family is a combination of Sephardic Jews who were running from the Inquisition for several hundred years. The earliest Inquisition trial record I have of a family member of mine to the latest is a 280-year time span. So 300
wow.
years, basically, they were running from the Inquisition. And then also substantial Native American ancestry from everything from the sort of mid 1800s, Genízaro slaves. So these were Native American slaves that were often sold into Spanish families in New Mexico and Colorado. So I have a lot of Genízaro ancestry, all the way back to a pretty substantial amount of Nahua ancestry, what would now be called the Aztec Empire. Um, I have a theory about this, and my theory is that if you were a secret Jew hiding from the Inquisition, that it was safer to marry native people than it was to marry a Catholic, right? And so that they would often, if there weren't enough Jews that you weren't related to, they would often marry Native American ancestor people. You do your religion, I do my religion. We go to church once a year. We don't rock the boat. And that this was a way of like keeping your practices going that wasn't exposing it to the Catholic
And
Church.
and how does that connect to what's behind you?
Yeah, so when I discovered all of this ancestry, I started collecting pre-Columbian pieces, being very, very careful about provenance. I want to make sure I'm never supporting modern looting, but also focusing on cultural groups that I have ancestry in. So I have a lot of like ancestral Puebloan and a lot of Maya and Mixtec and Aztec pieces, including all of these lovely pre-Columbian mushroom pieces.
Wow.
So this is all Mayan mushroom stones, a lot of Aztec pieces that also deal with psychedelics. A lovely Colima peyote bowl. You can see these are actually peyote buttons on the bowls. And then up here, oh, wrong side. The flipped camera confused me. I spun the wrong direction. This piece right in the corner here
Yeah.
is an Aztec incense burner of Xochipilli, the god of psychedelics. So this is
Wow.
a deity that his statue in Mexico City is quite famous. If you search Xochipilli, you can find it. He's covered in, they're often described as tattoos. They actually look to me like scarification, like they're raised, not inset, right? So it would be really easy to inset tattoo imagery, and you see that in Nahua, like Nahua sculpture. You'll see cut in lines. This almost looks like scarification of sacred plants. So
Mm.
there's mushroom symbolism. Actually, that is the mushroom symbolism on Xochipilli. So it's 3
Wow.
mushrooms cut down the side and then a cap from the top, right? So mushroom
Wow.
1, mushroom 2, mushroom 3, and then the cap from the top. So this is a symbol that is shown both on the base that he sits on and also scarred into his knees and elbows.
Wow. So for you, coming from looking at a book to as a young boy to now having these statues and relationship with your own ancestry, what would you say is your relationship now with psychedelics and plant medicines?
Yeah, you know, the weird dynamic is that I'm so busy right now in this exact moment that I don't actually use psychedelics all that often. DanceSafe has been going through some tremendous growth, tremendous periods of change. Yeah, it's a strange dynamic.
Well, and I mean it not in terms of use, I mean it in terms of relationship, at
Yeah,
least for
there
me.
I started collecting these things because I really liked the idea of having them. That was sort of the thing. Uh, they've definitely become something else for me now, which is this like powerful concrete, right? Stone. We say concrete, but an ancient person
Literal
using the same
stone.
metaphor would have said a stone reminder, right? Instead of a concrete reminder. They're stone reminders that our relationship with these substances is ancient and the laws criminalizing them are really new, right? the majority of particularly these lower pieces, like these lower stone pieces, so this would have been a mushroom figural piece that was probably smashed by the Catholic Church, right? So he would have had a body, but he was smashed, and so I just have his head. The majority of these things were older than the United States is now when Jesus was born, right? So we're talking about 2,300, 2,400-year-old reminders that our relationship with these substances for the vast majority of human history was one of reverence, respect, connection to community, and that we've been criminalizing these things for at most, a few hundred years. And that's really stretching the drug laws to really go as far back as we can. As part of a book that I'm working on, I was looking for the first drug law I could find that was a true prohibition of the drug, right? So there were lots of laws that controlled who could use drugs when and where, but that's actually just regulatory models. That's what I want, right? So like the Eleusinian Mysteries in ancient Greece was clearly a psychoactive sacrament. Like there's no real debate about that anymore. But it could only be used at Eleusis. We actually have a trial of a Roman official who was tried with using the mysteries at home.
Wow.
We have the criminal trial.
Set and setting.
Yeah, set and setting.
Criminal set and
But the
setting.
first law that I've ever found that was a true prohibition of the drug was an edict from the Spanish Inquisition banning what they called peyote. It's not clear if they're talking about peyote or mushrooms. That was a term that was used to refer to both. But banning the use of some psychedelic sacrament for the Aztec Empire that they just conquered, right? It's a literally inquisitional process for a government to say, no one can use this substance under any circumstances. That comes from the Inquisition, as far as I can tell. That was the first group that ever tried to pass a law like that. And so that's part of why I keep these things, right? These smashed ancient artifacts that show our relationship with psychedelics that were smashed by a church, so threatened by a tool that allowed people to directly experience the divine, that they were willing to burn books, burn people, take over jungles, erase knowledge to cut off our access to this experience.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that is, and the other reason is that I want to make sure they end up in the right hands. A lot of these things are already promised to various museums. And a lot of my collection is already at COSM, the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors,
Sacred Mirrors.
Allison Gray's church in upstate New York. Some on loan and some that I've given them. And so, yeah, they're making sure that these things have public exposure. For a time, I owned the only known Aztec bone carving of Xochipilli. It was, found in the 1940s. I had the original drawing from the archaeologist who had excavated it. And the minute I got that thing into my collection, it felt so utterly inappropriate to be sitting on a bookshelf of mine. I mean, it felt absurd.
Yeah, right. I mean, literally in a private collection versus in a place or with the people of origin or
Right.
right.
Right. No, and some of it, I've often thought about repatriating things back, and there's a reason that I haven't, and part of that reason is that I was told off the record, because there is no public database of all of the things not on display in the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, but I was told off the record that there are 280 mushroom stones in storage and 0 on display. Because there's so much that's been excavated there, right? That like it would be physically impossible to create a museum that showed everything that's been excavated.
Well, and you're making me think like, I know there's this would get into a conversation. I know there's a museum being set up and to help preserve the traditions of, of the Mazatec, right? But I want to come back to you and DanceSafe and just giving one thing I'd like to help advise people in this podcast is to help direct them towards like what kind of sources, what kind of things can actually be of help to them, to have a safer, more supported experience or better relationship. So what advice would you give someone who might be listening to this and hearing all the stories that you've been telling today?
Yeah. I think the most important one is that drug markets right now are incredibly adulterated. We're seeing things like fentanyl in ketamine. There have been cases of it in MDMA. That's not common, but it has happened. Certainly, in cocaine, we see fentanyl, pretty regularly. We've seen a galaxy of different research chemicals laid on blotter paper and called LSD, right? And so, individually getting a reagent from DanceSafe, getting the fentanyl test strips from DanceSafe, and testing substances is really the only way to know what you're putting in your body if it's not a natural product. There's never been a case where we've seen, like that type of adulteration within like mushrooms. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but it's never happened so far,
It's not as
thankfully.
common.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the
Although
very least.
certainly a lot of these manufactured mushroom products aren't mushrooms, right? They're
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 4-ACO
they're
or
for
some other
ACO. They're
analog.
whatever other random tryptamine is being pumped out of labs,
Whatever laboratory that was made in
right?
wherever
Right, whatever
country
lab
it
it was
was.
made in, to whatever quality it was made to. And so these manufactured products, I tend to be a little skeptical around. Um, And often because they're very difficult to test outside of a laboratory, right? You're going to have far more chocolate than drug. And so detecting the drug becomes really, really difficult.
Well, and it makes me wanna talk about the chocolate chip cookie problem. But like with the synthetics and
Yeah,
how they
no, but certainly
fester.
testing
But
the
I mean,
substances
I know
is
that'll
really
go
good.
into too deep.
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe
that's
we'll
that's
have
that's a
another
whole other podcast,
podcast
actually.
where we could talk about that. But I would just wanna, like, definitely would recommend people checking out DanceSafe, checking out, you have lots of education and materials
Yeah,
available for people. And I just, thank you so much for taking this time with me and with, the community to
yeah.
share a bit more about you and about your work.
Yeah, and the other thing I would suggest is, even if you're not interested in volunteering with DanceSafe, doing our online training, doing the Zendo training, like building the skills so that you can be a person in your community, right? DanceSafe is really predicated on peer education. Our job is to teach people who can then act as peers in their community to educate others. And so even if you have no interest in volunteering with DanceSafe, but you should, because it's a lot of fun. We go to festivals, we test drugs, it's great. Still doing that training so that you can build out the skill set to support your community is really worth doing.
I totally agree with you. Like I see it like kind of like taking standard first aid and CPR. Like you should have some basic skills as a responsible member of the community. You don't have to support any sort of use, whether it
Yeah,
be recreational, therapeutic, having the lock zone, like I have mine,
yeah.
and knowing how to use it. It won't harm people if they get it, and it's not useful, but it'll save
Yeah.
someone's life.
Yeah, the thing I've been promoting lately is, beyond first aid, a wilderness first responder course.
Wilderness
Because first aid
responder.
is often built on this idea of like, you just need to wait for the ambulance to get there, right?
Yeah, or the fire.
Like at a
Yeah.
festival, that is sometimes kind of a wait.
No,
Like
you're more
that,
of a wilderness
it's
environment
a
there.
wilderness
Yeah.
environment. And so, yeah, wilderness first aid and stop the bleed. Like, yeah, I mean, I have a stop the bleed kit like in my festival backpack that goes everywhere with me at events.
Yeah.
Like I have a tourniquet at festivals every
Yeah, no, I have like a real tourniquet, like, I'm gonna just use my shirt. Like, no, a real tourniquet where they have
Shirt's great if an ambulance is 5 minutes away.
no,
If it's
right. Like it's
25.
better than nothing, people. Like,
Yeah.
we can't advise on medical or health or
Oh,
whatever.
right.
Get a professional, all the good things. But I appreciate you bringing that up too, because I think, even if you just know someone who does have those skills, and when you're in a group and in a wilderness, setting. But thank you again. And
Yeah, thank
I
you for
just,
having me on, truly.
yeah, I had such a good time. I want to do this again at some time. In every episode, I hope we're giving you the source in terms of responsible community use practices, research, ideas. But in this case, we could maybe be more directly talking about source of product. Psychedelic source as a phrase is often used as a way to talk about who's your source of product, right? Very material focused. And I think it's really important to emphasize and make sure people who are focusing on just having an experience, right? That you're doing so responsibly. And that means
having the knowledge and testing product and empowering yourself with resources. But, sometimes you'll even hear people say, know your source, right? And it's very challenging at this time where most use is criminalized, that you make sure that if you are making those choices, that you're doing so with safe product, or at least safer product. There is real contamination of product. DanceSafe happens to offer some testing products, including for fentanyl test strips, as well as testing for different aspects. There's also now available potency testing uh, for things like psilocybin and LSD, which many people aren't as aware of. But there's a lot of product that's on the shelves, even quote unquote legally, or at least seems like it's legal product, that actually isn't safe. And I cannot emphasize enough, whether you find it in the nutritional shelf of your store, or a local smoke shop, or from a friend, the safety and responsibility is very important. It is life-changing, and don't risk your life in exchange for just a good experience. And yes, I also feel it's important, even if you don't feel that you feel like you want anyone to use psychedelics. It's important for all of us to have some good basic knowledge and awareness and safety. I personally don't use opioids and have never used opioids other than through medical use, but I still have a way to give people naloxone, right? Not only for that potential accidental consumption, but also for you never know when someone may need that support, and every minute counts. So I just wanted to take this time to encourage everyone, given that our name is indeed Psychedelic Source, that the safety of your products, the safety of your friends, of your family, really does depend on you being a responsible citizen and taking care of your own awareness and education, regardless of your stance on psychedelics and plant medicines. Thank you for joining me on Psychedelic Source. If you found value in today's episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and share with others in our community. And if you're a psychedelic practitioner, therapist, or coach looking to identify blind spots in your practice or determine next steps for moving it forward, take the first step by visiting psychedelicsourcepodcast.com. Until next time, remember, start low, go slow, and stay connected to your source.